Welcome back to season 3 of Questions You Didn't Ask. Thank you for continuing to support my podcast and therefore joining us in the fight to advance health equity and champion social justice. If you are new to Questions You Didn't Ask, you are in for a treat. The purpose of this podcast is to uncover the questions we didn't ask, to break silence and isolation, and to some extent confront our own ignorance, which has led many of us to express stigma, conjure fear, and rely on avoidance as defense mechanisms, which oftentimes leads to poor health and sometimes death. We are kicking off the 3rd season of Questions You Didn't Ask with our first video podcast due to the generosity of Health Lit for Wake. Their mission to dispel vaccine hesitancy and promote health literacy, which aligns perfectly with our focus today, the unique experiences of Black people with disabilities, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm excited to use my platform, Questions You Didn't Ask, to bring together a group of local experts to talk about the unique experiences of Black people with disabilities and how they were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Explore the specific healthcare needs of people with disabilities who are considering COVID-19 vaccines. Highlight community outreach activities and programs aimed at improving the health outcomes of people with disabilities, with a specific focus on COVID-19 prevention and care. Before we jump into the discussion with our distinguished panel of guests, I'm going to share some foundational knowledge to help our audience better understand this population and topic today. The first thing that is necessary for us all to understand is what is a disability and who it impacts. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a disability is any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. In a fact sheet on persons with disabilities published by the United Nations, I learned that around 15% of the world's population, or an estimated 1 billion people, live with disabilities. They are what we consider the world's largest minority. This figure is increasing through population growth, medical advances, and the aging process, according to the World Health Organization. As we see our populations aging past 70 years old, we find the chances of living with a disability increasing to the point that most people will experience 8 years or 11.5% of their lives living with a disability. So this topic is very relevant for most people. Yet many communities do not take into account the unique lived experiences of people with disabilities when developing health innovations, policies, programs, built environments, and more. The second thing I want our audience to be aware of is how do disabilities impact Black populations, specifically those in the United States? When reading an article in The Atlantic titled, "You Have to Scream Out, Being Black and Disabled is a Constant Struggle," by Shaleen Gupta, I learned 3 key points. Number 1, 14% of Black Americans have a disability, compared with 12.6% of the overall population. Number 2, 36% of disabled Black Americans live in poverty, compared with 26% of all disabled Americans. Number 3, disabled Black people often have to battle harder to get correct diagnoses and services. There's a long list of other things that we will learn about living with a disability as a Black person in the US. But I wanted to make sure that we all started out with this information. Now, with this basic information about disabilities and Black people with disabilities, what does this have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, I'm glad you asked. One thing we learned during and after the COVID-19 pandemic is that Black people in the US who were exposed to COVID-19 were more likely to become sick from or a carrier of the COVID-19 virus. What does that mean to be a carrier of the COVID-19 virus? Well, that just means folks who had COVID but maybe didn't have any symptoms and could have easily passed it on to other people that were more vulnerable to the virus. So, Black people in the US were also more likely to experience severe COVID-19 symptoms resulting in hospitalization. And finally, were more likely to die from COVID-19 or complications resulting from COVID-19 infection than their white counterparts. According to the National Health Law Program, people with disabilities in the following groups were and are at a potentially higher risk of becoming infected with COVID-19. People with limited mobility who rely on family members or direct support professionals increase the chances for contact with others who may be infected. People who have trouble understanding information or practicing preventive measures, such as hand washing and social distancing, or wearing something on their face, such as a mask. Maybe they have sensory issues, or they might be allergic to the material. People who may not be able to communicate symptoms of illness are also at increased risk of coming into contact with someone with COVID-19 and maybe not being able to share the feelings that they're experiencing or what their body is going through and the changes that their body's going through. Scholars at the National Health Law Program have advocated for better data collection on race and ethnicity and tracking the health experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, because you can get a clearer, more accurate picture of the lived experiences of diverse populations by tracking this information. Based on some initial data gathered by the National Health Law Program, they were able to hypothesize that being Black, having an intellectual or developmental disability, and living in a care facility significantly raises the probability of contracting and the risks of dying from COVID-19 compared to white people living in similar circumstances. In fact, a study published in December of 2022 by Carly Friedman found that the people with disabilities who were more likely to receive a COVID-19 diagnosis were people with cognitive disabilities, cisgender women with disabilities, Black people with disabilities, and people with disabilities in larger households. Friedman also found out that of those with a disability, those less likely to receive a COVID-19 vaccine were people with visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and mobility disabilities. Now, I hope you can better understand why this topic is so important for us to discuss. And I hope I've left enough meat on the bone to make this discussion with our guests even more interesting and impactful. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our guests for this series titled COVID-19 Conversations, Black People with Disabilities. Our first guest, Regina Mays, originally from Washington, D.C., found herself in Durham, North Carolina in 2001, seeking support for her family amid struggles with substance use. As a sole provider for her children, she embarked on a journey of personal healing, engaging in wellness workshops and therapy to break the cycle of addiction and ensure a healthier future. In 2016, Regina's dedication to helping others led her to volunteer at a recovery resource center, where she eventually became a certified recovery coach for substance use and mental health services. Through her work, she has supported individuals in starting and maintaining their recovery journeys, witnessing transformative moments of reconnection, stability, and growth. Embracing holistic health practices, Regina became certified in natural hair care, recognizing the impact of substance use and mental health medications on the body's hair and skin. In her unique chair of care, she offers a blend of healthcare services and compassionate coaching, fostering healing conversations and goal setting. While Regina's approach is inclusive, her coaching services prioritize attacking addiction while honoring the individual's autonomy. Trained in various techniques, including Tell Your Story, smoking cessation, and medication breathing methods, Regina empowers her clients to create personalized wellness recovery action plans for resilience and recovery. Our next guest is Dr. Dania Fannin, who is an associate professor and licensed speech-language pathologist whose research into caregiver-mediated communication interventions became personal when both her children were diagnosed with autism. With her early intervention expertise, she was uniquely prepared to support their development. Her journey began at Bradley University, where a chance course in language development led her to pursue speech-language pathology. She went on to complete her post-baccalaureate work at Southern Illinois University, her master's at St. Louis University, and her PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. Her postdoctoral research at UCLA focused on clinical trials for young children with autistic traits from underrepresented populations. Now at North Carolina Central University, Dr. Fannin collaborates with Duke University to uncover disparities in disability diagnosis among Black and bilingual children in rural areas. Her work, funded by the ASH Foundation New Century Scholars Research Grant, aims to improve diagnostic accuracy and early intervention for underserved communities. Dr. Fannin's dedication extends beyond research. As a member of the Duke Center for Autism and Brain Development Community Engagement Advisory Board, she actively works on community outreach to improve health outcomes, especially related to COVID-19 prevention and care. Dr. Fannin's commitment to enhancing services for culturally and linguistically diverse populations and her personal connection to her work make her an invaluable voice in our conversation about the unique challenges faced by Black people with disabilities. Our final guest, Felicia Williams Brown, is a community engagement specialist and educator for the Autism Society of North Carolina. Her work involves supporting families and people with autism on social media by connecting them to services and helping with system navigation. She is also the founder of Pioneering Change Consulting, LLC, where she facilitates trainings and creates pertinent content for the community. She is a certified community health worker, a Charting the Life course framework ambassador, a certified trainer for adult mental health first aid, a sexuality educator for individuals with IDD, a certified facilitator for the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, a certified instructor for Health Matters, and a certified facilitator for QPR suicide prevention. She serves on various steering committees, has been involved with numerous community projects, and is a UNC Lind Fellow, a prestigious leadership program for North Carolina leadership education in neurodevelopmental and related disabilities at the CIDD that provides interdisciplinary leadership training at undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral levels, as well as interdisciplinary services and care. Thank you all for being with us on Questions You Didn't Ask. So now that we have set the tone for our discussion with discussion about, what it is to have a disability, what it is to be a Black person with a disability, and some ground, work or conversation about what it is to deal with COVID and living during the pandemic, I'm going to open up this conversation a little bit more specifically to each of you. So, we've learned a little bit about how you all are connected individually to the disability community, but can you tell our audience in your own words, what makes you interested in this discussion and serving this population? We'll start with you, Regina.
Thank you again for having me. For me, it was very personal. My dad, much of my adolescent life, had an addiction to substance use. And just knowing how it affected the father-daughter relationship. But when he actually entered in and sustained recovery, my sister and I had a different type of dad, and we got to experience both worlds. Unfortunately, my dad passed away in 2001, right after 9/11, and so my sister and I are very grateful for the time and the folks that reached out to him to help him, because it wasn't family. He had to start from the streets. He had to start from outreach, from therapies and coaches, because the family had been dismantled so much. And so I guess this is kind of also my work. A lot of times I honor him, and I honor that my sister and I got to have that relationship with him before he passed.
And so, what connection, or in your own words, Dr. Fannin, what is your connection to the disability community?
Well, it started as an occupation as a speech language pathologist. So we work with communication disorders across the lifespan. So in schools, it's the person who helps with lists, R's. It could be stuttering, language disorders, and then autistic children go to school. So that's become a big, segment, of the work that we do. And then in the hospitals, usually people with stroke, swallowing disorders, cognitive disorders, traumatic brain injury, and so on. So I started, my first bachelor's was in advertising, and then ended up, doing speech pathology, doing the post baccalaureate, and it was during my postdoc that I had both my children. But I'd already started that knowing I was working in a lab where they were doing research for autism. So that started, my children were actually not the inspiration for me to be working in autism. It's just a coincidence. It just shows the commonality of the prevalence. And even though I was working in a lab with infants and toddlers who show autistic traits, my son wasn't diagnosed until he was 4. I didn't know my daughter was autistic until she was about 18 months old. So the signs are really subtle and different for everyone. So identification is difficult for people even like me who should know better. I thought they were just late talkers. So that's where my research lies, is early identification, and especially trying to close that identification and service access gap for underrepresented populations. So so I've been, in the course of teaching future speech language pathologists, I've also been doing research for with autism. And then, of course, it became personal with my family, just raising children, who are autistic.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Doctor, now are you a PhD? Okay. Well, Felicia, tell us about, in your own words, how you're connected to the disability community.
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey began with my son. That's how I got connected. He's 15 now, but he was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2. And he had some speech delays. That was like the tell sign for him. He wasn't reaching a lot of benchmarks. We were fortunate as a Black family because our pediatrician followed the proper steps to get us connected to early intervention services. So he linked us to CDSA, and from there our trajectory has been pretty solid. But I kind of got more involved with this work as an advocate because I soon learned that what I thought was quality in services and access to care was not a reality for a lot of people. A lot of our families are getting later diagnoses. A lot of our families don't feel empowered to advocate for their children. A lot of the resources are not being shared with our communities. And I just kind of organically found myself in these spaces where I felt I guess, a need to stand and say, hey, we need to do something about this. So my work my personal life has kind of guided my professional life in that sense. And so from just being a part of parent groups and then being invited to tables and places and spaces I never even imagined, but there has been a shift in lived experience now. And so they're realizing how much caregivers and parents and people who are living this life, how much value they bring to the table. And so my world, professionally and personally, all encompasses that.
And I think we all relate on that level. I commonly say on this show and in different spaces where I speak and share my expertise that I am what I do and I do what I am, you know, and this seems like a common thread in our discussion. So now I want us to take the time to educate our audience. You know, some people that are going to tune in and watch Questions You Didn't Ask, they're going to know about autism and know about substance use and mental health challenges. And in my case, with my daughter with Down syndrome, they may know a little something about that. But can you tell our audience a little bit more about the specific disability that you specialize in working on? And what are some of the key features of that disability that tend to most define people's lives? And I may go directly to Regina and see her shaking her head. And so share with our audience a little bit more about it.
So one thing I always try to educate not only recipients, but also family members, community, any chance I get, is that substance use, especially between the ages of 18 to 24, is just kind of the outlayer of other things that might be going on. And the reason why I said ages 18 to 24, that's the demographic that has usually went through the IEP 504 system and the school system and been on all kind of psychotics and Seroquels and everything else. And now that they're young adults, people can't tell them what to do anymore. And so, but they still have been on that medicine for so long to where now 9 times out of 10 they turn to street use. And so that is I just started smoking marijuana to cope, but then I started popping pills. Or I started doing this, and it's a real thing. And so even to try to directly answer your question about the focus, I can't because it's so broad. I mean, I have schizophrenia, bipolar, all of those things, undiagnosed, misdiagnosed. And a lot of times because, you know, just as the transition of mental health saying now we want to break these stigmas, we can't undo the history. And a lot of times those were the age graphics that were the test children. And so they went through all these failures of the system to where they no longer trust into the system, especially in our Black males. A lot of times, some of the males I deal with, they didn't even get real help until they got justice involved. And so now when I do that work, it's like trying to get ahead of the game and be preventive. As a coach, that's what we're supposed to do. And I'm a peer coach. And I say that with a certain specialty because a lot of people want to use that peer specialist and peer work now, and it gets misused a lot of times. And so with that being said, I'm supposed to be on the prevention side. I come in on the aftermath, but my work is really geared on how can I now work with young people so they don't feel the stigma of 504s and IEPs, and they learn to say, how is that Seroquel making them feel? I have a lot of my younger folks from middle school. I mean, I have middle school age children right now on committing suicide list. And COVID highlighted that even more. And I'm not gonna go too much, leave room for others to say. But during COVID, when it started hitting other populations outside the Black community, that's when Congress and others wanted to call it an issue. But they didn't want to call it an issue in our community before COVID-19. Because now you're seeing your Caucasian and Asian and high thriving students starting to self-harm. And I'm like, but my Black folks was doing it all along, and you weren't coming with the money, you weren't coming with the aid. So for me as a recovery coach, like, it's so broad and so many issues, and yeah, I can't just name one thing.
And I think that that's really important for our audience, and even in our discussion, to remember that, you know, mental health and substance use, you know, shows up in so many aspects of our lives and may look different depending on, you know, who you're talking about and what their circumstances are. And then I appreciate the fact that you bring up the fact that, you know, oftentimes substance use is secondary to the primary issue. It's what gets people to pay attention, because maybe they weren't taking the primary issue as seriously, you know? And so that becomes the way that people can sometimes receive the help that they weren't getting otherwise. But it's also a failure of the systems that were supposed to be there to help them. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Fannin, can you tell us a little bit more? And obviously, you know, Felicia, you all share this expertise around autism, but in different, slightly different ways, right? And so what are the key features that you see, Dr. Fannin, that this disability, you know, tends to play out in terms of how it most defines people's lives or shapes how they live, you know, move through the world and interact with people in the community?
Well, through my studies, you know, speech language pathologist, pathology means disease, right? Disorders. So we work with communication disorders, and you know, people say, like, autism activists say it's not a disorder, right? It's a difference. However, there's still a disability, right? Society still disables them. So I see my role as helping with those communication, speech, language differences that because they communicate differently, it disables them. So I told my students, I'm not an autism expert because I'm not autistic. I can help you, I help either establish or enhance communication skills for autistic people and social communication. So that involves, you know, different, you know, social skills that help students be able to, you know, get through the day and then also work afterwards. But again, back to the autism advocates, you know, autistic communication is different. It's not a disorder. And we don't want to be teaching them that they have to socialize this certain way. That's called masking, right? And so it's really in our field, you know, our field has been accused of being very ableist and saying you're supposed to communicate this way. However, people are like, I want a job. I want to be, you know, I just need to get through this job interview. How do I ask this person to prom, right? So just that, finding that balance there, being neurodiversity affirming, but, you know, teaching skills to get through, to know what to do when the police pull you over, right? For Black families, that's so important. You know, all of the, you know, activism, you know, don't tell your child to, you know, obey people, you know, anti behaviors, all that goes out the window when my Black son is driving the car, right? Black parents have to think of something different. So just the different ways of communicating and enhancing communication and social skills, that is the primary issue, you know, I see or work with when it comes to autism. but I'm still learning from autistic people and activists how to do it in a more neurodiversity affirming way.
And I'll add, absolutely to what you said, Dr. Fannin. It's usually, well, you'll hear people say, you meet one person with autism, that's one person with autism, because it is a spectrum disorder. So it's similar to what you said earlier. There's no one clear identifier, right? It's just how it presents in a person. That's why it's a spectrum. But the common characteristics is that communication challenge, that social challenge. A lot of times there's sensory processing.
Yeah.
So like sensitivity to light, to sound, textures, those are common characteristics of a person with autism. And I think a lot of times, what makes it, I guess, a huge challenge for our community in particular is because there is a lot of us that know, like we've heard about autism, right? But because there's no clear indicator that this is, so it could be misinterpreted, it could be masked as something else, and families sometimes have a hard time accepting a diagnosis for that reason because of stigma, or families might not be supportive to another family's experience because they don't understand it. Those dynamics happen a lot. But I would say for autism and the Black community and where we are at this point, it's important to remember that it is a spectrum disorder. Socially, having a social deficit is a huge deal. We don't think about that because a lot of times what we learn socially, we pick up instinctively, but people on the spectrum have to literally be taught these social skills. I use an example of, I'm not a man, but I have been told that there's this social rule. When you go to the bathroom, you don't stand right next to the guy and, who's urinating or in a urinal. You don't tell your little boys that, right? They just instinctively pick it up. But a person with autism, you literally have to say, don't do that. Or don't pull your pants all the way down to the floor. When we instinctively learn these unspoken rules for a person with autism, a lot of problems occur because of these unspoken rules and cues that they just miss. So those are key indicators to add to what you shared about autism.
But some people would say, well, why are we teaching them these social rules, these neurotypical social rules and these false conventions, right? That if your son likes pink, he should be able to have the pink backpack.
Right.
Whereas some people think, but I know he'll get beat up at school. Right. So if you make the decision to say, how about another color?
Yeah.
Then you're seen as not being neurodiversity affirming. I mean,
it's a very sticky slope, right? Because there are things that are acceptable socially,
yes.
and it's you have your preferences, but in a society there are social norms. So you're not oppressing a person; you're just teaching them how to be safe and how to assimilate in a social setting. So it's like a person who likes to maybe touch themselves, for lack of a better example. You're not going to say, well, it's okay, and then come across as, a person that I just want to be neurodivergent affirming. But what you're doing is you are setting them up for a lot of issues. And so there's a balance that we have to always consider when we're talking about these things.
Thank you for joining us on Questions You Didn't Ask with me, Naisha Frey, and my guests, Regina Mays, Dr. Dania Fannin, and Felicia Williams Brown. Tune in next week as our series, COVID-19 Conversations, Black People with Disabilities, continues.